Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
I'm really, really pleased today to have Matt Pegas on the podcast of New Right fame, the podcast he has with Dan Baltic, of Strange Flows. The podcast you have by yourself.
Yep.
Author of Dragon Day, the Black Album. You've got a new, really, really exciting project coming up that I'll let you intro with Dan Baltic as well.
Absolutely.
So what else have you got on?
You did a pretty good job summing it up. Thank you for acknowledging the Strange Flows thing. Obviously, probably mostly well known for being the co-host of New Right with Dan Baltic, as you said, but I do have a lot of independent stuff, whether it's the novels, which I know we'll be talking about today, Dragon Day, which came out with Terror House Press in 2021, and the Black Album, which was self-released this year, are my two books. And yeah, Strange Flows. Basically, Strange Flows, the Strange Flows and New Right orbits universes are not completely different. Strange Flows has a bit of a theme of esotericism, whereas New Right is more overtly, literary for one thing, as well as political. But I've done many episodes have been both Strange Flows and New Right, so the spheres aren't totally separate. Basically, just Dan Baltic is a busy man, a lawyer in New York, and I'm here on the other coast in LA, and there's a lot of interesting people to do podcasts with. Often, I like to most, if not nearly all, Strange Flows episodes are recorded in person, so I guess that's kind of the differentiator. But basically, just that's when I have excess time to do podcasts in person, they end up under the Strange Flows category. To back up, Matt Pegas, I'm a writer as well as a podcaster, and you sort of teased it a bit, soon to be publisher, I guess is what you could say. Dan and we've sort of soft launched this, mentioning it on podcasts. Hard launch should be soon with a logo and a site. Stay tuned for that. But we are putting together our own publishing imprint. It's going to be called New Ritual Press. And we've got a couple people we're already talking to about publishing. And I mean, maybe we'll talk a little more about that later, but that's, something of an announcement here. And just generally, oh my, I don't know if that's symbolic of something. I have this bird feeder out of my window here, and it just fell off and probably shattered. But I'll deal with that after the pod. Where was I? General man about town with the sort of Twitter dissident right-ish literature scene.
Yeah, I came across both you and Dan through the New Right podcast because So we were talking about this before we started recording. I've, in the past 6 to 12 months, become really interested in this self-published literature of people who are writing really high-quality work and just putting it out on the internet at the moment, Amazon, because it works quite well.
It does. And
in the future, it might be through some other service. But there's this really, really exciting spring of creativity coming up of basically a bunch of weirdos on the internet. And that's how I became aware of the two particular weirdos of you and Dan Baltic. Eventually read your work. But with Dragon Day and the Black Album, I'm going to be talking about together because they're very, very deeply linked works. And not only because in the Black Album you have an entire essay about writing Dragon Day and responding to Dragon Day, but there are even deeper links between the two, and it does seem an enduring preoccupation of yours, at least across these two books, is this notion of order and chaos, or of this primordial chaos anterior to any sort of order, and which actually you can form order out of, and the project of forming order from that chaos being something addressed in both books more explicitly in the Black Album. And so I want to approach talking about them mostly through that lens. But before we even get to that, do you want to intro Dragon Day and the Black Album? Because I've heard you reference Dragon Day, for example, on podcasts, but I was never completely sure what it was about, what it was.
Yeah, this is an issue with the book. And this ties a little bit into the New Ritual Press thing, just in a really brief manner. the cover for Dragon Day leaves something to be desired, and I liked it when it first came out. So this is no disrespect to Matt Lawrence, who did this cover. He's also the fellow who does like Delicious Tacos covers and what have you. Everyone thinks it's a fantasy book, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to actually intro it. Everyone thinks it's a fantasy book based on the title, but more so based on the cover, which has a sort of manga-looking dragon on it. And nobody wants to read. I mean, fantasy is already niche, but especially like quasi-self or small publisher published fantasy is it even harder to sell. So that has really hurt the book. And I think it will be good to sort of give the gist of what it's about. It's almost the opposite of fantasy. It's kind of a close psychological realism, I would call it. Basically the sort of log line for the book is it's about a troubled young college freshman who falls under the influence of a professor with dangerous, esoteric, apocalyptic ideas. A professor who ostensibly is sort of left wing, but has a sort of secret, more fascistic, esoteric, apocalyptic teaching. So the book, this is quite flattering to the book, but I can say it because someone else described it thus. It's sort of Michelle Welbeck by way of The Secret History, the book by Donna Tartt, The Secret History, which I don't know how widely that's read actually, but that book is about some college students who become so transfixed on their lessons on ancient Greece that they kind of commit their own Dionysian ritual crime. That's The Secret History. Similar things happen in Dragon Day. The writing sort of style is, I guess the Welbeck comparison that some have made is somewhat earned. It's a little bit of this, not quite Hemingway, but it's written sort of sparsely. I was pretty influenced by Bret Ellis and like Chuck Palahniuk. So it's a little bit of that minimalist, masculinist style, but approaching these sort of somewhat esoteric themes. It's kind of, some people call it, one of the blurbs on it, calls it like an incel book. Toby, the protagonist, is never explicitly called an incel in the book, and it's not really about him perseverating on not getting laid in the same way that, great book, but, mutual friend, Eric's, it is quite similar to A.R.X. Hahn's book Incel, actually, in many ways, but the focus is somewhat different. The focus is a little more on, again, in that secret history way, in a crime that ends up being committed, and power dynamics behind civility and behind the trappings of a college campus. I'm told there's like this aesthetic book talk trend called dark academia. I don't know too much about it, but it's this kind of appreciation for, library stacks and old towers, and again, very secret history, I think, would be a reference point there. I would, humbly say Dragon Day kind of fits into that dark academia aesthetic a bit. I think I've about pitched it as much as I reasonably can. I'm told it's good. I'm told people enjoy it. It's basically a thriller. It's 120 pages. You can read it pretty fast, and I, again, humbly do think it's a pretty good book and worth reading. I really enjoyed it.
You mentioning that it comes across as a fantasy book is the case. That's what I initially thought. I decided to read it because I'd heard it referenced so many times. I thought, I'll give it a shot. And I think it's on page 13 or something. I won't spoil too much, but there's a particular scene in the gym locker rooms that I didn't see coming. I thought, God damn, this book's going in directions that I really didn't expect. It's really, really good to read with the Black Album. Or I think reading Dragon Day, then the Black Album is really good. And if you want to intro the Black Album as well, it's a really interesting one because it's much more obviously experimental and experimentally written than Dragon Day, and forms a really nice companion piece to it because there are sections of the Black Album. It was roughly divided in two between fiction and essays.
Yeah.
was continuing this chaos and order
Very much. Yeah.
dichotomy, if I'm not reading into it too much. But it's quite eerie reading it right after Dragon Day, because you'll be in the fictional parts referencing Dragon Day.
Yeah.
As an almost Matt Pegas character talking to an almost Matt Pegas character. Sort of your psyche split in a chaotic and ordered
Definitely.
half.
Yeah. Yeah, I know it is. The line between fact and fiction does get blurry with the Black Album, and I think any interpretation of the way that ultimately comes across, as you said, the first half is fiction, the second half is essays, but some of the fiction is kind of like essays written from a fictional perspective, and honestly, some of the essays probably lapse into things that we kind of said this offline before hopping into it. It's not that the essays are fictional or insincere, but there's probably moments where they're very experimental essays. A lot of the ideas in them are not like propounding some kind of dogma or idea I have, so much as trying on different things, ideas for size, many of which maybe are no longer ideas I'd even identify that strongly with. There's a strong theme of occultism throughout the book, and I will be forthright about my interest in the occult and esotericism in Dragon Day, as well as in the Black Album. But I'm also like a normal enough guy. I'm not some wannabe witch or something, as any reasonable person must. I also recognize the pitfalls of occultism, the dangers. So not that I disavow anything I wrote, because again, all of it was in an experimental spirit. But I guess what I'm trying to say is even the essays explore some pretty out there ideas that were kind of all just part of my process of thinking through some of these issues. Some of these issues of chaos and order, as you said, and again, it's not that I disavow them now, but already, I'm probably in the next phase of whatever my evolution is. I definitely appreciate, any interpretations people have of kind of the rhyme or reason to the fiction and essays split, and the order that they're in, the way, the folks at Tookie's Mag had some very interesting ideas on this, the way that the essays interact with the fiction. It's all there, I think there is a reason all these pieces came under the same heading, the Black Album, and it really works. But in some ways, the dirty secret with it is like, I just hit a point, about a year after publishing Dragon Day, where it's like, well, I want to write another book. And, as many of us in this embryonic scene are, I also work. It's not like I have all the time in the world to brainstorm and come up with another novel. And it became much more of a thing of like, well, what do I already have? Some of the essays were already written. And what do I want to write? And several stories, several ideas for fiction were in my head at that time. What can I write? I think, you mentioned before we got on here about how you have to wake up at 5 a.m. your time to write. Like, we're all kind of pressed for this precious hour to hour and a half, whatever it may be, of time to write. Long story short, I wanted to write another book, but I felt a little bit squeezed by my resources and the time that I had. And it was like, I'm just going to have to write exactly what I want to write. And it's just going to let it come out of me, see it all together and shape it up. And that's kind of more so than any specific like master plan. That's how the Black Album came to be. I knew that, just roughly like, yeah, fiction and essays, why not? They're going to have similar themes. These are things that preoccupy me. I can explore them in both essay form and fiction form. Maybe I've already explored them in essay form, and now I want to explore them in fiction form. But yeah, no, I do think as with art, a lot of it is unconscious. I think there are interpretations you can have of the way these things interact with each other. And I always find it flattering when people have ideas about, the grand scheme of what the book is suggesting. Some people have said, and I would, I would not counter signal this, because I think there's truth to it, that there's a little bit of an interplay between, esoteric and exoteric. Leo Strauss is a thinker that looms over the book a bit. And those are themes familiar to anyone who's familiar with his work. There is a little bit of a, I'm saying some things more overtly, and there's other things where, maybe I distance myself from the full implications, but like, these are ideas that should be explored. So there's definitely stuff like that. But again, the main thing is it's exactly what was in my head during a period of time. And it's, it's the Black Album, which is a bit of a music reference, but it's also kind of captures that archival feel, I think, where it's like this is who not who I was per se, because there's more to me than in the somewhat dark pages of the book for sure, but this is what was on my mind from roughly the time Dragon Day was published till about the end of last year.
I guess it was an unconscious alchemical process that led to the, I wouldn't say even the appearance of order. I think that the scheduling and programming of the particular pieces in the Black Album does have order. It's it just might not have been a conscious one. So were you, for example, with the two Vegas pieces, which to me very much felt like this is the daytime and the nighttime. This is the ordered and the disordered, or chaotic and ordered. Yeah. Was that intentional? Were you going for that, or was that just completely unconscious?
Well, yeah, you bring up a good question. I guess I can't fully say it was completely unconscious. It's more that I wrote the nonfiction first, which, of all things in the book, is a pretty verbatim account of a day that I had. And it just, because the Vegas piece in the fiction, it's not all about Vegas. That's just a thing that happens at the end. I think it's only 3 or 4 pages, in fact, that the character is in Las Vegas. It worked so well, in my opinion, there as well, that that I couldn't resist sort of putting it in. And I do think, obviously I can't say it was unconscious because I knew what I was doing, and I made the conscious choice to include them both in the book, which I had serious reservations about. But at the end of the day, I really liked the nonfiction piece, and I really liked it as a punctuation on the fiction piece. And I even do like the weird sort of two-way Alice in Wonderland mirror thing. And so I kept it. So including the two was obviously not unconscious. I knew what I was doing, but the way that they interact is somewhat unconscious or somewhat open for interpretation. Yeah,
that's very cool. At least I was struck by the order of it, or the. I really, really enjoyed seeing first the very, very unsettled, mass shooter obsessed side of Vegas, and then the sort of the daytime Vegas of you just going around gambling.
No, absolutely.
That, at least to me, especially following the chaos and order sections, which I'd like to talk about. I'd also like to talk about what you believe now. So I wasn't aware how much you'd moved on, and also actually how much of the Black Album was fictional or not, too. Correct. I really, really liked that ambiguity.
Yeah.
But particularly with the mindset of, say, Alexander Dugin's reverence for chaos, for your stated reverence for occult chaos, I very much was seeing those connections. And if it wasn't intentional, then it's very fortuitous, or maybe it's simply part of the artistic process of, if you follow the internal logic of an artistic idea, that internal logic has its own structure and forms its own structure, whether the person creating it or following it is really aware of its implications or not. So whatever the process by which this book's structure emerged, I really do think there is an interesting structure within it.
Definitely. And I don't want to give the Black Album too much credit, but I think with any work of art, with civilization itself, I'm going to resist the urge to go too broad and sweeping here, but I think there's an interesting, it's less like you say, like, what do I believe now? It's less that my beliefs have changed. But as of today, us having this conversation, what strikes me as interesting about the order versus chaos dichotomy, and you kind of started to describe it pretty well, and Alexander Dugin is certainly, of all like modern thinkers, the one who I guess I followed or followed the most in his thinking on this, the idea of a chaos preceding order, a chaos out of which order can emerge, the idea of primordial energy. I'm not sure if Dugin ever makes this comparison, but it's sort of related to like that, Heraclitus's idea of fire and the fire behind things, I think. Hopefully Dugin and others wouldn't be like, no, you're wrong. That's not what's meant by chaos. But that's my basic understanding is there's energy, this aimless energy behind things, in short, that must be channeled. Well, that humans can channel into things, the same fire that burns your house down, cooks dinner. But I guess, yeah, in talking about this today, what interests me as much as of the sort of more occult idea of channeling that fire into things through the power of will, which certainly interests me. I'm also interested in the extent to which, the extent to which chaos and the primordial energy behind things, flows quite spontaneously, independent of any human will, maybe in line with God's will, maybe in line with nature. Those are the broader topics that I will remain agnostic on here. But the extent to which order can arise spontaneously or seemingly spontaneously, or if in human hands, perhaps unconsciously. Dragon Day and the Black Album, maybe especially, are sort of influenced by a little bit by Aleister Crowley and general occult ideas of channeling, the will. But just existentially in my life right now, and as well as philosophically, I'm quite interested in the extent to which primordial energy and chaos flows more naturally into order or something that can be perceived as order. Is nature orderly, or do we just perceive it that way? Without getting into the weeds too much, I think it's very interesting how both, purposely harnessing your energy and bringing something into the world, that can be an act of will. Certainly, any creative or artistic person knows that you have to kind of see it in your head to create it, et cetera, et cetera. That's an important force, but I'm a little more in awe at things that happen, completely outside of conscious will. That was a bit of a tangent, I guess, but
there are so many different things to go off on there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like before we get into that and start diving in, for listeners, can you just explain what occultism is? Because I've listened to enough death metal that I felt reasonably at home with quite a lot of this stuff, even though I've never specifically looked into it. But I imagine there are also other people with much better musical taste that mightn't really know what occultism is. mightn't know what chaos magic is.
Man, I wish I had a good definition off the top of my head. So let me just start sort of ass backward here. The definition of magic, of which is just one part of occultism, I guess, is like, the science and art of creating change in the world in line with your will. So that's kind of what's certainly behind the Black Album, and to an extent behind Dragon Day, with the fixation on chaos magic, is that idea of using sort of esoteric or occult means to affect reality.
And if I can jump in, does that so there's not necessarily a supernatural element here. It's actually an application of the will.
Yeah, I don't think there's necessarily a supernatural element. In general, that would be the default position, that occultism and magic both somehow involve that. But like with chaos magic specifically, which is certainly most of what I was interested in with Dragon Day, I believe it's a little more agnostic as to whether things are specifically supernatural or not, or whether maybe they're explicable scientifically, or it gets into some weird territory, and I'm not the chief scholar on this, but I do think there's a certain agnosticism. It's results based, so it's like it doesn't really matter if it's supernatural or what it is, if it works. This in the more scientific element of magic, I guess, taps into like manifestation and new thought, and somewhat scientifically verified, although not in all of their implications, idea is that, if you believe, basically belief in something happening gives it a greater chance of happening for any number of unconscious reasons. So that's I started with that because magic sometimes is a little easier to define. There's actually handy definitions. Occultism is a little more contextual, because what does occult mean? It means the hidden, right? So anything that is somehow esoteric to a given society or culture, but that is also spiritual, kind of could be labeled as occultism or esotericism. Of course, there's a question now, like what is occulted in the era of the internet? There's not really any secrets anymore. So that kind of gets complicated. The way I define, I know I myself introduced this word occultism into the discourse here, and I believe it's used in the Black Album. I like the word esotericism a bit more. The way that I define that, and the way that I continue to define that, even as I'm no enemy of organized religion. Like and I get into that in the Black Album too. I think organized religion is good. I'm not another fedora wearing atheist or another person who's trying to own the church or something. I think there's an interesting interplay. I think mainstream religions and organized religions that really codify. Again, we're coming back to chaos and order. I think organized religions are codifications of the basic awe at nature, the basic stuffs of spiritualism are codified into traditions through organized religion. And esotericism / occultism to me is kind of like the quasi science or quasi anthropology almost of trying to understand the spiritual impulses, outside of their codification into specific traditions. So trying to understand what works about prayer, what works about saying the rosary, may also work in terms of meditation in an Eastern sense, or, magic, people's, occult practices. I believe various things are effective, probably and this is a total California cliche that I embrace in the book and in life. In addition to esotericism, I'm quite influenced by yoga and practice yoga, which involves, basic sort of movements of the body, and other, meditation practices that are not specifically in line with any one religion, but are sort of general things that any person at any time has access to, that people find, or historically people have found, brings them in touch with this awe at nature or sense of the infinite. I'm interested in like psychedelic drugs as well. So, there's a lot of cliches being made around
California to the bone.
But maybe I'm kind of making a distinction here. The psychedelic drugs thing is actually interesting because a lot of people like both maybe are part of an organized religion, but maybe have some experience with this. It's like, where does the spiritual experience you have in church meet the spiritual experience you have on psychedelic mushrooms? Like, to me, the basic stuff of that, I believe, is fundamentally the same. And trying to understand that in a way outside of any given, not necessarily anti, but just simply outside of any specific codification into organized religion is basically what esotericism is to me. I could go on about this. I'll let you rip. But the Black Album, it's kind of confessional. A lot of some readers of it, have been Catholic or otherwise religious, and I think there's a respectful dialogue there. It's not a book that's trying to turn you into a devil worshiper, or even particularly trying to get you to practice magic. I may lean a little more close that's where I've like changed a little bit. I probably lean a little closer in the book to like, you should try this, than I would now. I mean, not really. A lot of it's can be silly for some, can seem silly to some, but can be effective for others. Practicing that, I think that the book is somewhat confessional in nature. It's like, because I grew up Catholic, I've kind of been exposed to a variety of different religious traditions and respect them. And I think in a lot of ways, the book is me as a spiritual and even religious in a certain sense, even without necessarily the organized religion affiliation at this current point. Someone who is a basic believes in God and is spiritual, and has all these influences. It's kind of me trying to make sense of them all and trying to use them in a way, hopefully not in too self-serving a way, because that's where I differ from a lot of, deep water occult stuff, is that it's all self-serving and self-worship. That's not really what I'm after, but I am just kind of trying to make sense of the world in a way that is neither, ultra traditional or specifically religious, because I'm obviously not part of any of those traditions, but that's also not like merely the kind of more general, very soft sort of liberal Christianity either. It's I'm looking for something in between, and the book is part of that search for me. I feel like I kind of went all over the place there, but hopefully that was cogent enough in parts.
No, very cogent. It's my problem is picking which of those paths to go down, because there's a lot here that I want to talk about. I like that you describe the Black Album in some parts as confessional, because, for example, the part where you're talking about Pop Magic by Alex Kazemi or Kazemi, don't know how to pronounce the name. I've only ever read it, but I appreciated actually, and this is where I also appreciated that it's ambiguous whether this is fictional or not, but you saying basically, look, I'm trying these things.
Yeah.
And I'll get back to you on how they work.
Yeah.
I quite appreciated both the implicit humility in that of I kind of don't know what I'm doing. I'm giving it a shot.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm glad you appreciate it. It's also probably a drawback. I'd probably be selling more books and having a bigger platform if I really thought I knew what I was talking about.
I mean, in part, that's why I read fiction that's either self-published or published by very small presses, because that's where you get, and I mean this in a positive way, but the really fucking weird stuff.
Yeah.
That let's say an agent or an editor or a publisher who is more interested in selling a lot of books would say, look, maybe tighten that up to be more consistent with popular trends or what the audience wants. There's something very, very special about slightly unpolished books doing something very odd, something that's not particularly commercial. It's I just find it artistically much more interesting. And so doing things like having a whole section of your book, quite a long essay, it's one of the more substantial essays. And I feel like one of the more important or sort of skeleton key essays in the Black Album.
Definitely.
And for Dragon Day, given how linked these books are, I feel it's quite a skeleton key essay for Dragon Day. Because in Dragon Day too, because I was seeing the split between Chaos and Order everywhere. The Wallingford versus Oliver split as well. Yeah. Between this chaotic and ordered. I suppose
it's an interesting way of looking at things, right? Yeah.
It's that's how things appeared to me, and I was like, man, this guy's a genius. He's written 2 books that are organized in the same way. But I really liked that ultimate shrug of the shoulders in such a central essay of going, yeah, I gave it a shot. I don't really know. And then you just finish the essay.
Yeah.
I interpreted it as pretty bold, but people might see it as wishy-washy. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's up to them.
Either. I shrug once again. I do think it's an important essay, though. I agree with that. I think when I was writing it, it's not that I thought it was genius, but I definitely felt, and I felt this at other times with just things I've done in life or other things I've written, the spirit just kind of took me. Like, it was like, these ideas have been percolating in my head for years. This is how they've came to a head for me. And I'm just going to document that. And I think that, I mean, gosh, I don't know. At the time I was writing it, and still now, I really thought, again, in a humble way, I really thought this is kind of tightening up something conceptually. And again, the essay in every step of the way, it's taken, the name of it is taken from a Mike Ma book. Or a chapter in a Mike Ma book.
You were talking about Mike Ma in it too, yeah.
Yeah, and Gothic violence. And it's a lot about Bronze Age pervert.
Hmm.
It's a bit about Alexander Dugin and Heidegger and Thomas Ligotti and some other fictional. So like every step of the way, it's mostly me citing other people. I'm not really taking credit for anything other than bringing some of these thoughts together and maybe naming a general trend that others are more content to leave as a sort of esoteric thing. And I guess that is my humble contribution. And the part about Kazemi at the end, I think even at the time I was writing it, Kazemi has since become more of a household name, not household name, but a name amongst indie literature people. A lot of people have their issues with him. So now it's even more ironic, I guess, that, this essay, well, I mean, he knew Mike Ma, so there was a kind of interpersonal connection, but his book Pop Magic is it's, to a lot of people it would appear very silly, like it's this kind of pop culture saturated celebrity name dropping thing about just a modern sort of easy for anyone to read take on basically chaos magic. And for me, after all this deep water stuff with Dugin and BAP and all that, it was like, this is my more hands-on experiment with it. And yeah, I don't know, what the ultimate implications of that are, but kind of as you said, it's just, for me, it's a simple thing. But I hope there's kind of intellectual material in that essay that resonates with people. And the audience for that essay and for the Black Album in general remains pretty small. But I've definitely talked to a lot of smart people who are very receptive to it. So that's about all really we could hope for with some of these books, and it lives on. Even though I have maybe moved on from some of the more, obviously recognizably occult elements, that's not necessarily the way I'm going to be projecting myself moving forward. The general gist of that essay very much, I think, will continue to live on through my work. And to bring it back to something we talked about at the top of the conversation, New Ritual Press is taken from that essay. And it wasn't me forcing that onto it. Again, I'm working on this with Dan Baltic and a couple other associates. And we went through a lot of names, and everyone was like, well, New Ritual sort of just sounds the best out of these. And it really harkens back to that essay you wrote. And indeed, I think the general spirit of trying to create something new in the world that carries this is kind of par for the course of the thing, that both carries the spiritual wisdom of the old, but brings it into a totally new foundational tradition or ritual, remains like a really vital part of my personal creative spirit, and I think a lot the spirit of many of my associates as well.
Yeah, I do want to talk about ritualism as well, because your thoughts on that were really interesting. But I don't know, just briefly lingering on the Black Album, it is interesting you saying that you think it probably has limited appeal, and yeah, like the Black Album especially, I really enjoyed it. But like many of the books by people I've had on here that I've really liked, it's the sort of book where if someone came to me and said, Jack, I hated this book, I'd have to say, like, yeah, it's like, I kind of get why you did.
Yeah,
it resonated with me. It's a really odd book.
Yeah. Yeah, you kind of have to know, which is a limitation. Like I'll admit that. Like it's, and they said this on Tuki's Mag. Like if you don't know about the podcast, I mean, yeah, I don't know how much value it does have for you, and that is a limitation. And
I think it has.
That's why it's called the Black Album rather than like another. It's.
I think it has quite a bit of
insider document.
It's an interesting piece in that I think if I read it by itself without any background on your particular internet personality, without having read Dragon Day, it would feel somewhat unmoored. There'd be certain things in there that would be interesting. So, for example, you talking about this essay where you're referencing Dugin and Mike Ma, I do think something valuable that you do in that is you take many interesting aspects of Dugin. Granted, I've only read The Fourth Political Theory, so I'm not a Dugin scholar by any stretch, and remove the bits of it that make it less interesting, because probably my biggest problem with Dugin is basically all of the interesting things he's doing are ultimately in service to offering a justification for Russian imperialism.
Yeah.
Which it's like you're talking about all of this interesting stuff, talking about bringing in the sacred, talking about removing the individual from the center of political discourse, talking about putting Dasein as the political subject, and then it's ultimately, well, I want Russia to invade countries around it. And it's like you just suddenly come slamming back down to the ground, and it's quite jarring. So you de-Duginized Dugin, which I think in itself is something worthwhile, but it's the Black Album's is interesting artifact that I'm not sure would work so well outside of the internet age. That a large amount of my enjoyment of it was from having listened to you podcasting and then reading this odd book where there are definitely ghosts of that, but also it feels like there's misdirection in it as well. And it's also just when you're podcasting, I'm not saying you're being insincere, but you're only revealing part of yourself. So you're not revealing your entire life or your entire person. And the interplay between all of these things is, I think, one of the things that makes the Black Album really, really interesting. And shorn of that context, I probably wouldn't have enjoyed it as much. But the fact remains that we do live in the internet age, and hence I think it's ultimately a strength of this book.
Yeah, well, thank you. And no offense taken. I broadly agree with you, and I very much view. I think that the book, hopefully, for the the inner circle of a few people who've actually listened to a great deal of my podcast and also read the book. I think the two things really enhance each other. I kind of view less so with Dragon Day. I would argue, Dragon Day.
Dragon Day, I think, could actually have quite a bit of appeal because it's very snappily written. It's short. It's exciting. Like you get straight into intrigue in the book. Like the hook is present very early.
Yeah. So that's a more traditional book. It's a novel.
Yeah.
But I do think Black Album was kind of a product of me podcasting and connecting with people online and reading their books to do podcasts about. The Black Album in many ways is the questions that lingered with me after doing the podcast, or the things that I had to explore and even more I wanted to explore in even more depth. There may be things that interacted more with me emotionally or existentially, and then that goes into the fiction, which is quite some of the essays are fairly revelatory, but maybe the fiction even more so. Even fiction, though it may be, sort of magnifies emotions and reveals things about me. And I think that it very much is like if you're interested in kind of I would never expect anyone to be interested in my like evolution as a person, say, right? But so at some point, if you listen to a dude enough on a podcast, if you read enough of his stuff, maybe you are a little bit interested. And if anybody is interested in that with me, then you have a lot of podcasts to listen to, and you have the Black Album. And I think the hope is always that in being personal, we also can branch out and say things, explore things that are relevant to political discourse or the world. I would humbly submit there's a bit of that in the Black Album, stuff that similar kinds of dudes to me at the very least, or maybe even people who aren't that similar to me, maybe can glean something from this. But hey, if it's not for you, it's not for you. The Black Album is a very, very much more personal book in that sense. And again, I really, just to riff off of what you were saying, all I was really trying to say was, yes, it and the podcast, both Strange Flows and New Right, are very much part of the same broader semi-public evolution in thinking that I've been engaging in for the past few years. Yeah.
One aspect of the politics in both books, but particularly in the Black Album, is one, they're not overbearing, which I appreciate. I'm fairly allergic to talking about current affairs or something in a book of semi-fiction, sure. But it's this strange intersection between practicality and, to my mind, continuing practicality, but I'm sure there'd be some people who'd consider it frivolous. But this idea of you identify modernity as this interesting state of removing awe, of removing structure, of feeling unmoored, and then start looking at, okay, well, what can we do about this? Because many of our traditions, so our actualized structures from chaos that we've previously used to orient ourselves are not working so well anymore. So what do we do? And you seem to be setting this goal of, well, how do we come up with new rituals? You identify ritual as a possible way to finding some sort of solidity again. Does that sound like something you were doing, or have I just completely misinterpreted you? Because that was an aspect of it I thought was really interesting.
That sounds like exactly sort of the fundamental question animating the Black Album. And Eric Hahn, in his essay on it, he went in all kinds of places in his review, some of which I'd never thought of, but ultimately he came to that impasse as well. Modernity, and I'm not one of these radical accelerationist trads who like hates modernity. I live a pretty modern life, and I don't harbor homicidal or chaotic rage against it. But there is a sort of spiritlessness that I find I come up against. And I think others do too. And I think very much you articulate it really well, basically, that, there's this issue of like, I recognize this lack of spirit within modernity, but I also can't quite, in my case, and I think others as well, I also can't quite bring myself to, be part of this ultra orthodox religious order, or even just be a trad Catholic. Obviously I could, or Orthodox Christian. Obviously maybe I could go down that path. Maybe that would be good. I don't promise that I won't. There's a lot of people who do end up sort of taking that role, but for me, it always seemed like somehow a retreat from. I live in LA. Maybe that's part of it. I don't know. It's like, I expect even if I did become Orthodox or become traditional Catholic or something, I would still be interested in this question. And I think some tradcasts are, and some Orthodox Christians are, how do we sort of fight on the cultural plane of modernity? That's another thing that always appealed to me about Dugin's work, is he's always talking about working within the postmodern paradigm.
That's where he's at his most interesting. Before, absolutely, like I said earlier, he's like, well, we've got to bring this back to Russian hard power. Which is where it's like, you just got boring again.
You saying that's interesting too. I think that marks this sort of this is a somewhat of a side topic, maybe a little bit related to this too, or related to the fact that I don't have a good answer. But it's kind of screwed up. Like it's the plight of the, and I'm sure there's probably some good Plato quotes that I don't have on the top of my head, from the Republic or something. It's almost like I think philosophy and the type of philosophy that Alexander Dugin does, and that Heidegger did, and that Leo Strauss was interested in, and that, this sort of pure pursuit of truth. I believe in that pure pursuit of truth, but it's almost like you need, I don't know if this is like a good gloss on something from the Republic or what, but I feel very much in line with Plato saying this. Maybe I'm wrong. It's almost like you need the city, you need civilization to somehow justify their whole pursuit of philosophy or something. Like if you can pursue truth, but it has to be like within the confines of, of something either, I don't know if it's a tragic sense that like philosophy always must become politicized, or if it's simply something that happens. But this that you're saying about Dugin kind of gives me a light bulb for that idea of like, he is kind of in his process of pursuing the truth about Dasein and anthropology and sort of what could be, what how man could sort of operate, at his most spiritually refined. But in his case, it's like, in order to justify any of the enterprise, it has to be in the context of, Russian imperialism for some reason. Like, Yeah, I don't mean to derail the conversation here, but it's like I
It's
completely
not
agree.
derailing at all. Like this is interesting. This is why I have
Yeah,
you
I
here.
think so, right? Like, I completely agree that there is this sort of thing like, oh, I guess it's all, especially after Russia actually invaded Ukraine. Not to give an opinion one way or the other on that particular issue, but especially after that happened, it's like, oh, I guess this is what Dugin was talking about, like this. And there is this sense of like a letdown, but then at the
Mm,
same time, it's like, if Dugin was not advocating something this tangible and real geopolitically,
yeah.
like what else would he be talking about? Then he'd be, I don't know, would he be more like Derrida then? Just kind of like another post Heideggerian sort of riffing into oblivion about
Yeah, the endless
Dasein and
spiral.
beingness, and
Yeah.
it's almost like you need to somehow root it to something. Sorry, I
Yeah,
don't
does it
know.
need to cash out eventually into the
Yeah, something like
material
that.
world? Yeah.
Yeah, and that also has a question with Heidegger himself. Heidegger and his Nazi affiliation,
Mm,
which scholarly research on always seems to be changing. Growing up studying philosophy, I was always told, "Oh, his Nazism doesn't really matter." And then I feel like more recently, post the alt right, and actually, frankly, ironically or funnily, not ironically, but funnily, post kind of Dugin. I can't remember what the book was, but there was some academic book by a fellow at the University of Toronto about this. I don't remember what it's called. Um, but basically recontextualizing Heidegger, like actually no, his Nazism probably did matter. And I kind of myself and my own reading on Heidegger lean toward thinking that. And I think it's a similar issue where it's like, if you really want philosophically, if you really kind of want to reorient these heady topics of of beingness, and and I'm not going to be able to do a good gloss on, for someone who's not familiar with Dugin or Heidegger listening to this podcast, I don't know if they'll get a lot out of this, and I'm maybe not in a position to give a great gloss on Dasein and what it all means, but
Good
it's
luck
definitely
giving a gloss
interesting
on
stuff.
Dasein in a few
What's that?
minutes. Good luck giving a gloss on Dasein in a few
Yeah,
minutes.
it's not easy. But basically, as a critique of modernity, bringing this back to the question you asked me, bringing this, a critique of modernity and the limitations it puts on man, and the the negative influence of technology on the spirit of man, and these kind of questions are really interesting. I don't think you have to be a Russian imperialist. I don't think you have to be a Nazi, but I do think, yeah, you, as you said, you kind of eventually need to cash out some of these headier spiritual
Mm,
philosophical considerations. You do kind of need to cash it out into some kind of, if not political program, then at least some real vision for life, if not
mm.
society.
And some manner of action in the world. It.
Some matter of action in the world. You certainly like Bronze Age pervert who's kind
Mm,
of manifest sort of explicitly not a Heideggerian, but he is a Nietzschean,
mm.
which is related, has a vision for that, maybe sort of Junger influenced as well for being a man of action in the world. And he's no small influence on me. And the Black Album kind of strived for some idea of that, of the guy who works out and is self-assured, and is cultivating his strength. I think that's about as far as I get in the Black Album, is co-signing on that idea, poppy in our sphere, that at the very least you can get your son and lift weights, and to that I would add obviously creative endeavors, I think, are transcendent as well. But that said, I don't think I, in the Black Album, quite transcend the issues with modernity, and I'm not
Mm.
latching on to some Dugin idea of Russian imperialism as a counter to modernity.
I
For
didn't get
Dugin,
that impression.
there's validity to this. There's validity to this, of course, but for Dugin, it's like geopolitically, Russia can counter the United States, and therefore, metaphysically, Russia can fight against the modernity that the United States represents, right? I think that's loosely the idea, but then it's like, is Russia really traditional? I don't know. Maybe it is.
Because that's the
Dugin has
fascinating
that. I don't
aspect.
know what I have, but yeah.
That's fascinating aspect of. I mean, modernity is a very slippery term, because I guess 200 years in the future they can talk about modernity and it'll mean something completely different to what we mean. But
Yeah.
the purposes of this conversation, I think people broadly know what's meant when we say modernity, but this, I guess, this is ultimately a philosophical system. This combination of highly, highly materialistic utilitarianism and antipathy towards religion or anything that has some sense of the supernatural, and really a dissolution in capital. And I don't mean this in a sort of a Marxist, anti-capitalist way, but I do think the phenomenon of capital and commodification
Definitely.
is foundational in modernity.
For sure.
But
yeah.
it's a highly transmissible complex of ideas, or a memeplex, because for, say, Russia and China, which are held up as the possible counterweights to the United States, which is, I guess, a metonym for the modern condition, they've both been infected with this same commodified, utilitarian, very, very materialist memeplex. Like, it's hit both those countries and has reorganized them from within as well. Like, China is not a very spiritual place. It's
no, China certainly is
hyper capitalized.
Yeah,
Russia as well. So
I've never been, but yeah, like broadly, it doesn't seem to me that it's exactly in line with what Dugin would perhaps.
Because that's why, again, it's the interesting bits of Dugin are still. I guess it's also probably a question of, you're probably only going to cash out into an interesting place in the world once the metaphysics have been worked out to a sufficient degree. So maybe it just means Dugin's not quite there yet, or he's holding on to this present concern of, my country's not big enough, and that's just distorting everything else. It's I guess it's probably two things. Just given where I live in the world, like, my father-in-law remembers the 1968 invasion, so there's a constant nerves about a gigantic country very, very close by to a country of 10 million people.
Right.
So that's just a personal aspect that can color my reading of Dugin. But then more broadly, what annoys me is it feels like he's almost onto something really interesting, or he is oriented towards something really interesting of what would a politics look like without the liberal individual as the political subject.
Yeah.
It's like, when I hear that, it's like,
definitely doing interesting work.
Okay,
Yeah.
keep doing that. That sounds interesting.
Yeah.
But then, he's got this kind of this almost stake in the ground, just holding him onto this blood and soil nationalism, which has today been infected. And when I say infected, it sounds pejorative, but I'm sort of agnostic as to whether modernity is a good or a bad thing. I think it's too mixed to really.
Me too. Me too.
Come down on.
Yeah, definitely.
In a hard way. But it's that blood and soil nationalism of his is so infected with this modernity that it really, really distorts the rest of his project. The bits that I want him to pursue.
Oh, sorry. You're saying you think that the blood and soil nationalism I'm sure Dugin himself would be like, oh, I'm not blood and soil, I'm this. But like, in practice, it's definitely of that ilk, right? And you're saying that you can't quite separate the blood and soil nationalism from modernity itself.
I feel like his particular conception of it, just given that Russia and most of the world really is so affected, so deeply affected by this.
Oh yeah. It's deep. Yeah, you're right. I think you're correct about that. And again, again, not the scholar of this, not to give my specific opinions. Like, we see it a little bit with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's like, people can say what they want about whether or not. Again, I really don't even want to get, whether or not. What does Ukraine represent? Should the United States be giving this much money, X, Y, or Z? But like, at the end of the day, like, is Russia, is this really like weighted in the metaphysical way that Dugin would like it to be? And to me,
I guess the question is,
no,
does the invasion,
like another modern? Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Does the invasion represent a sort of a way to exit modernity?
It does not.
And it's like, no, right? I don't think so.
Yeah. It just seems like another somewhat sad war to me.
Yeah, that's
no, gosh, I feel like there's a lot of interesting stuff here on
this is part of why I wanted to have you on, because when I was reading Dragon Day and the Black Album, I was like, there's going to be a lot to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. And I geopolitics doesn't come up too much in either book, but both books I think are haunted by these questions that do have geopolitical implications. And Alexander Dugin more or less makes his way into both books. He's not named in Dragon Day, but it's kind of implied that the professor maybe is part of some network.
He sounded quite Duginite.
Yeah, very Dugin-esque. Okay, so personally, not to just keep ping-ponging different names around, one way I quasi find my way, not out of this predicament, but sort of keep living day to day without making specific political commitments, I would say, contra to Dugin, and this puts me more in line with the Baps of the world. I'm a bit more of, it's almost cringy to say this, so off the cuff, but like I'm a bit more of a Nietzschean than a Heideggerian at the end of the day. I think that Heidegger, loops in ultimately somehow. It's ironically because he's also more influential on lefty Derrida post-structuralist thought, but just practically in terms of his philosophy, he meshes a lot better with that kind of blood and soil nationalism, much more with traditionalism in general. Like, sure, there's Nietzschean conservatisms, but at the end of the, like, Nietzsche is fundamentally a forward-thinking individual, much more so than Heidegger.
Much more antinomian.
Much more antinomian, much more, dare I say, survival of the fittest, almost. I mean, he's not synonymous with social Darwinism or Darwin, but there's more of a sense in Nietzsche that, like, the Übermensch, will come about somehow, right? And I'm not some horrifically, autistic, insufferable philosophy nerd that I'm always thinking about, the Übermensch and how we must create the Übermensch. But to an extent, in terms of this general predicament of modernity and its spiritually sapping force, I lean towards a more Nietzschean, like, we're in a period of some kind of chaos where things are being refined and the better men will eventually come forth, almost as a force of nature will they eventually come forth and bring us to the next era, whether in 10 years or 100 or 1,000, like there is this thrust of nature towards something higher. I lean more towards that than the Heidegger thing, which is somewhat more amenable to we need to go back. So
return spelt with a V.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's unfair to say Heidegger totally meshes with that, but I think he meshes with it a bit better than Nietzsche. And as you said, I'm not sure if modernity is totally a bad force. I kind of don't think it is. I kind of think there are good things about modernity. That's certainly, and I was already probably there at the time I was writing the Black Album. Earlier in my like online career when I first got into traditionalism and right wing stuff, I wouldn't necessarily have said that. I would have been a little more maybe reactionary. But I think there are, sort of just common sense, like we don't need, pick your poison, we don't need to be at war all the time. We don't, obviously a lot of technology and medical technology, there's a million things to sing the praises of. Like there's these things are not inherently degenerate. But they have brought with them this strange spiritual problem of nihilism, of no longer finding meaning in life. And I kind of think, for me at least, rather than being specifically reactionary, like, oh, we must go back in X, Y, or Z ways, I lean more towards in each of you that, like, this is just things shaking themselves out. And I don't know. I'm gonna shrug as I do in the Renaissance of the Ritual essay. Like I don't know if that's a very good answer, but that's kind of my own way of squaring like living within modernity and not being one of these accelerationists who want to destroy everything. It's like I think we'll find the only way out is through, and I'm not exactly sure what like kind of gives me hope politically or spiritually in the world today, but I don't think it has to be a specific commitment like totally against the United States or totally against Europe. I kind of think in time maybe something better will come along, and that I'm dissatisfied by my own answer there, but that's kind of in terms of this general problem of modernity that the Black Album explores. I don't have a good answer yet, but I lean more towards something Nietzschean and frankly somewhat more individualistic than the sort of return to older orders.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a line to be drawn between, say, your stated Nietzscheanism, your concern, particularly about nihilism in modernity, which is my main concern with modernity as
Yeah.
well. The pervasive nihilism, which spreads. Like, it's whatever happened in. I'm not sure where you'd isolate it, but probably to Europe in the last few centuries of the previous
Mhm.
millennium. Whatever happened there and then spread to the rest of the world does carry with it intense nihilism. So
Yeah.
wherever it touches, people seem to be quite hopeless. People stop having children. Whether the children part is just a function of children being really, really difficult, and now there's more effective contraception. Like, there might be a very straightforward
I think it's a
material,
mix of the
yeah,
straightforward and the spiritual at the
definition,
same
but
time. Yeah.
there does seem to also be an intense pessimism which convinces people not to reproduce.
Yeah.
Um,
What's a general, just like what's, because nihilism is, we think of nihilism and we think of like doom and gloom, but like it's also just banality. You know what I mean? It's thinking
yeah,
like, well, what's
it's
the point?
emptiness.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
doesn't have to be
It doesn't have to be
something. It doesn't
unhappy
have to be
even, but it's
dramatic.
the
Tearing out
lack
your
of
hair,
meaning. Yeah.
gnashing your teeth,
Yeah.
and tearing at your clothes. It could be a very quiet emptiness,
Yeah.
which for most I think it is. And it almost, that emptiness is revealed in many popular activities. So I think of them as anesthetic activities. Say
Yeah.
porn, gaming, drugs, drinking, casual sex. There are a lot of
Sports gambling.
profoundly
Yeah.
profoundly unerotic activities, which are, I guess, which are highly stimulating, completely unerotic, and highly anesthetic.
Yes.
And I think
Yeah.
you only really give yourself over to profound anesthesia when there is some sort of emptiness, when there's something you don't want to be feeling.
Definitely. Yeah.
But sorry, I was just saying, with your Nietzscheanism does show through, and your concern about nihilism, and then your solutions of basic personal ritual of
Yeah.
how to pull yourself out of nihilism, or how to create structures around yourself and your own structures, importantly, from a Nietzschean perspective, that you might be able to use to orient yourself within quite a dissolving environment. And I found that really interesting. It's
Yeah.
sort of kind
Yeah.
of practical application of Nietzsche.
Yeah. I think so. And that's where the Kazemi kind of came in, is that he was very, I found the book sort of liberating in terms of like, oh, just like do whatever you want, like in terms of ritual, like light a candle, whatever. He's not the only person who's ever said that, and a lot of it is just cheap high school witch stuff at the same time. But I just don't think it's totally in. I don't think deciding I'm going to light a candle today for this reason is as antithetical to lighting a candle in church. I think.
Mm.
I mean, this is where I censor myself, because it's like it's probably better to be involved with an organized religion. It's just that there are also issues with certain organized
Yeah.
religions, of course, which is the old catch 22. In the essay, which is kind of was sort of written for a right wing audience, I guess. Um, there's a lot about like, oh, how like a lot of organized religions, certainly this would apply to the mainstream of the Catholic Church, are basically super liberal overall, and there's all these insights people may have that may lead them away from those kind of liberal or feminized instincts. So the essay sort of makes a pitch towards like something more Bronze Age pervert-esque, of like, you kind of make your own spiritual ritual practice. There's a bit in there about like comparing like yoga ritual to working out, stuff that may be a little cringe to some, but that very much spoke to me while I was writing it, and still now, that you can sort of ritualize these attempts to become stronger in a harder edged way that maybe you'd get in most forms of organized religion. Clearly, I haven't quite worked it out sort of for myself. I think I think that the rituals that people, participate in the confines of organized religion, very much have the benefit of tradition and the benefit of other people being involved, and those are all really important parts of the reason that religion is good for people. I also just do have this belief that even divorced from all of that, we as human beings have these inherent abilities to make our own rituals and to kind of be in touch with God or the divine in a more direct way. But yeah.
Yeah, okay, there are a bunch of places I'd like to go with that too. Actually, before we go on though, because now we're talking about left and right wing stuff.
Yeah.
Do you have a definition for what left and right is? Just because those are they're slippery terms and different people can mean different things with them. So just for the purpose of this conversation, we can just say what you mean by that, and I'll just use that definition.
Yeah, I define right wing as inegalitarianism. Right wing is not believing things are naturally equal. But like I am right of center. I wouldn't call myself far right. Maybe other people would. I don't know. But
I think that's
I'm
fairly
philosophically
meaningless
right
term
of
by
center.
this stage. It's been so overused. It's far right is such an overused term. I think it is effectively meaningless.
Yeah, I don't think this is even that controversial because I don't want to straw man the left here. Few people think that natural. That there's hierarchy in nature is totally natural. If you're right of center, as I am, you think that in some way, shape, or form, that kind of hierarchy is good and orderly. You don't necessarily have to be like a complete Darwinist, might makes right. That's kind of how I define as like pretty far right, and I'm no stranger to some of those ideas. There's a million gradations of this, but philosophically, I think everyone from pretty moderate conservatives who are kind of more fiscally conservative or something to fascists and to weird, back to nature right wingers. Like, I think it's a basic exaltation of some kind of hierarchy, whether it's like super rigid and scary hierarchy with a monarch or a dictator at the top, or even just kind of Republican, like things work better when businesses are allowed to function. It's all about hierarchy. Whereas left wing, again, from the furthest left to even the more moderate left, is based in the fundamental instinct to make things less hierarchical, more equal, more egalitarian. So that's the definition that I.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that'll just make things much more clearer.
Yeah,
much more clear going on.
And so, because I introduced the right wing, left wing thing with the Renaissance of the ritual essay, going off that, like, regardless of one specific stance on immigration or the church's teaching on X, Y, or Z, I do think we can say about certainly many Christian denominations as well as other religions, there is kind of a more globalizing influence in a lot of those organized religions that do. I do think if by my definition, almost all religions are at least a little right wing, because I don't know. I can't think of a religion that totally dispenses away with like some kind of hierarchy. There's a reason why religion correlates with being right wing, pretty much everywhere, and that's because it is, frankly. But within broader organized religions, I do think there's a more egalitarian kind of bringing things down to its lowest common denominator ideology that isn't necessarily the whole of the religion, but like slips in there pretty well. I've definitely gotten that with Catholicism, not to disrespect it, but anyway, the only reason I went off on that is because in defining left and right wing, I think that's where I had first introduced it, was in considering, spiritualism. But anyway.
Yeah. So with these ideas of making rituals, of making symbols, do you think just simply the act of doing something over and over again is sufficient to make it an effective ritual to whatever purpose you're orienting it towards? Or are there certain symbols that are more effectively ritualizable? It's one book I'm very, very influenced by is The Forest Passage by Ernst Junger.
Yeah. Oh, you
wherein
mentioned that. Yeah.
yeah, where he, I suppose his approach to this is, well, I mean, it's quite Nietzschean in the sense of it's an individual creating symbols, finding his or her own way to the forest, which is this sort of this purely experienced state, this world of being, which is divorced from logos or exists anterior to logos or any sort of order. It's almost this Gnostic experience of chaos and
Gosh, wait,
understanding
sorry.
one's
What's the
part of it.
book? Forest of. I gotta
The
read
Forest
this.
Passage.
Forest Passage.
Yeah.
And he, not to, I'm sorry to rehash exactly what you just said. I just want to make sure I'm understanding. He believes that through Junger's like, by the way, I haven't read enough Junger, but in terms of people who are
He's
sort of maybe in
fascinating.
line, yeah, and in terms of people, especially towards the end of his life, who maybe are in line with some of what I'm saying here, Junger would be probably near the top with his
And
psychedelic.
he grew more
experimentation.
interesting as he
Yeah.
as he lived, because when he was younger, so I don't think he was ever a Nazi. I think when he was younger, he was very much a fascist. And
Yeah,
as
he was a German
as he grew
nationalist,
older,
but-
he got
Yeah.
far more interesting. He got more and more mystical. So
Oh, yeah.
the Forest Passage, I think it was published in 55. Well, I might be wrong on that, but sometime in the 1950s. It was about halfway through his life because the guy lived to be 101.
Yeah.
Despite fighting in
like the
2 world
70s, right?
wars.
Yeah, I know.
getting shot repeatedly. But he, being a German, believed that there is the world of being and the world of becoming. Capital B
Yes.
for both. It's, I think, just spiritually demanded of every German that
Yeah.
they
Right.
consider the world in these terms. But he believed, so of course, yeah, we day to day live in this temporal, this changeable world of becoming. But he believed that there are certain symbols which point the way to the world of being, which as human beings we're instantiated in the world of being. We are of it. We just don't always experience it, or most of the time we don't experience it. And he believed that certain symbols could be created which were so potent that they at least pointed an individual in the direction of some sort of contemplation or some sort of action which could lead them to that direct experience, that gnosis
Yeah.
of the world of being, of whatever reality is external to us or whatever reality we ultimately are a part of. And I found it quite beautiful that this former highly decorated soldier was saying that the way to retain yourself and to retain a connection to your humanity in an age of, he called them titanic forces,
Yeah.
unleashed by industrialism. So, for example,
Yeah.
he considered Hitler to be unleashing these titanic demagogic forces. How you keep yourself is by creating these symbols artistically and using them as almost as signposts orienting you towards this experience of a deeper reality. And so this is a
Jeez.
convoluted way of getting around to asking, do you think there are certain symbols or rituals that are more charged and more effective at ordering chaos? And
I do now if Junger says so. But no, but seriously, like, it sounds like I really need to read that book. It sounds like maybe he got further than I did in my book, which would be fitting for a person of his stature. It sounds like maybe he was in fact animated by a lot of the same questions that animated the Black Album, that he thought, yes, to answer your question, yes. And I was going to kind of give a more wishy-washy agnostic answer, like, well, maybe, well, and that, and I would still say this, it's the intention behind the symbol that matters more than the symbol itself. But within that, it sounds like Junger, and this is where I'm sometimes agnostic on this, though I'm certainly like God and religion oriented enough to want it not to be totally subjective. Like I kind of think maybe there is, at the very least, like some kind of collective unconscious to to bring what's his name, Carl Jung, not Junger but Jung, into the discourse. Like, I'd like to think that there is something a little more objective that we can kind of all orient ourselves toward, right? And within that, maybe there's certain symbols that can get us there better, but I am a little agnostic because I do think the intention behind it has a lot to do with it. I think even in a Jungian sense with the collective unconscious, it's like these symbols that seem to bring us more in line with something eternal are nevertheless, the mimetic sort of mind or aesthetic child of many, many minds operating unconsciously. So I'm a little agnostic about the details, but basically, yes, I do think, I certainly think some of these symbols can be much more effective than others. And even though the essay Renaissance of the Ritual is very individualistic in its prescriptions of like, do this yourself, I do think a great measure of the success of this kind of spirituality and ritual is, the same way that you'd measure the success of an artistic product, which is whether or not it resonates, with other minds and other people. So a little agnostic as to the details, but basically, yes, I do think there is power that operates beyond the mere individual, whether by means of something more supernatural or merely a product of the collective unconscious. Kind of want to talk more about this Junger book, though.
It's a remarkable book. His earlier period, which seems to be the period of his writing getting more attention, particularly on the online right, I find a lot less interesting. Him talking about war, the transformative potential of mechanized warfare in World War One. I mean, because it's an account of such an extreme experience. It's interesting from that perspective. So I'd recommend Storm of Steel to people. But
and I'm sure in terms of like evolution, like you don't have the later Junger without that.
No, I think you need it. I think you need him. I think war is an inner experience. He's basically talking about the transcendent experience of being of basically trench warfare, of like
cannon fodder,
surviving an artillery barrage, and it's like the so transformation of that, which probably, like, if you're talking limit experiences, World War One's pretty limit. So I agree.
Limit,
I think you.
Sorry, what do you mean by limit
need
experience? Like an experience that brings you to your edge, as it were?
Yeah. To this, at least for him, it was to this point of just depersonalizing.
Yeah, damn, it's so interesting, and like his later use. Again, not to advocate anything, I'm still kind of in my own early stages of exploring this at all, but like his later use of psychedelics, and I believe he explicitly compared using high, heroic doses of psychedelics as a limit experience as well. And like, I mean how many other dudes have done that? Like, actually, like there are probably others who, both used psychedelics and gone to war, but like not World War One, and maybe not the doses that Junger took, like he really, it's hard to find someone who like had these like limit hippie type experiences as well as these limit, chud type experiences, I guess.
Junger's fascinating because I think in many ways you could consider him to be. Sorry, you consider him to be a hard right hippie.
Yeah,
because
if you're talking, how I think of myself, but
if you're talking, say, hierarchy, if he grew up in an incredibly hierarchical society, thrived in it, was a highly decorated soldier. Another fascinating thing about him, something that makes him so singular, is, like you were saying, so he fought in 2 world wars, was very open to new experiences, yet really got into psychedelic drugs. He took LSD with Hoffman.
Yeah, right.
But tying all of this together was also, he actually could write really well.
Yeah.
He could write really well and was compelled to. So he wrote extensively. And really the flower of all of this is his later works. You've got certain later works like The Glass Bees, which is an interesting book talking about really the effect of technology on us. But I think he's at his most interesting when he goes full German mystic, but brings to it a real sort of a soldier's hard-headedness and demands for practicality. It's this weird intersection of practicality and we need poets to create symbols to lead us to the world of being.
Yeah. So what No, it's very interesting, and I'm just realizing throughout one of my big takeaways from this conversation is to read more of Junger.
Hmm.
But not that I'm totally unfamiliar, but this idea of being versus becoming, I'm kind of curious how you would define that. I mean, again, it seems a little. I know it has a history in German culture, obviously with Heidegger as well. It's also, I think, and this looms over the Black Album as well as Just My Life. Like it's somewhat Eastern, right? Like
Hmm.
sort of Buddha. It's very kind of European Buddhist. Is this my initial gloss on it? Like, this the world of becoming is the world we live in most of the time, where we're preoccupied with work and the minutia of material day-to-day survival, and as well as just distraction and pleasure. That's all world of becoming, and the world of being is this transcendent reality that's in theory behind it. Again, and for people who've taken psychedelic drugs, whatever, and the negative view on psychedelic drugs is that they just fuck with your brain and they make you think things, and there's not really metaphysical correspondence. It's not necessarily what I believe, and it sounds like it's not necessarily what you're going to believe, but it's an easy enough when you're in that kind of state, or not, or you don't need drugs, if people find it through meditation, prayer, contemplation, there's this basic sense that like there is something transcendent and static and perhaps beautiful behind things that we kind of go in and out of experiencing, but most of the time we're in this world of becoming, which is far from all bad, but which has its limitations. Modernity feels sometimes like it's this pure world of becoming. That's my instinctual gloss on the distinction as you laid it out. Is that kind of correspond with your understanding of the becoming thing in Junger and elsewhere?
Yeah, it's sort of difficult because it depends on whether you're looking at Junger or someone like Spengler or Evola.
Yeah.
Or say even with Kant, say the noumenal and phenomenal distinction.
Yeah.
I think it maps on not perfectly, but reasonably well to that. I think, basically you've got this idea of some sort of atemporal, unchanging wellspring, sort of capital R reality, something that is external to human consciousness or how we phenomenally experience the world. And then sort of contained within that is our everyday experience, which is contingent, temporal, which is the world of our senses, the experience of living through these things.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Is how I would generalize it, because again, basically every thinker who uses these terms and believes in them will put their own spin on it.
Yeah. No, that's definitely everyone has their own spin on it. It is so simple in certain ways, as you just defined it. I think the idea of something transcendent versus basically the ins and outs of material reality, but like I think the basic idea is rather simple and quite beautifully simple, but as soon as people start to offer their theories of it, it becomes very, very specific, nuanced, and sometimes complicated.
As soon as you start picking it, it's almost a thread, like in a sweater. If you start pulling on it, you realize it's a lot longer than you anticipated.
Definitely. And then kind of as we were talking about with Dugin, like once you start pulling at that, whether by necessity or circumstance, I guess, like it ends up becoming grafted onto one political ideology or the other. In Dugin's case, Russian imperialism. I'm kind of curious, and I should know this, but I don't. I'm kind of curious. I think probably Junger kept his politics close to the vest towards the end of his life, or maybe wasn't that political towards the end of his life. But it's kind of interesting to think, kind of how he would apply it. Evola, who you mentioned, we know as far right, and that's true, and he was connected
a super fascist.
He was a super fascist. But even there, it's like, what did Evola? You know what I mean? Like it's.
In terms of what it means concretely, so we did an episode in this podcast on Ride the Tiger, which Evola described as his practical work. It's, a dumbed down work for people who want to just take action in the world of becoming. And it's, I just don't really fucking know what it would look like if someone was living according to the principles of becoming the differentiated, then the integrated man, according to Ride the Tiger. Like Evola just didn't get very practical. He wrote so many books. I'm not an Evola scholar. I'm not. I don't even enjoy him that much. It's just our listeners have a seemingly unlimited appetite for Evola.
Yeah.
Who I think more than anything was an author of book titles that get chuds really going.
For sure.
The Path to Cinnabar, the Revolt Against the Modern World, Ride the Tiger, Handbook for Right-Wing Youth. You can see why chuds like it. The problem is, when you read Evola, you realize that, say, Twitter Evola and Evola are very distinct. Evola is spending 300 pages talking about the metaphysics of yoga. It's so much more autistic than people who have never read Evola think it is.
It kind of seems like, and I haven't read enough Evola to say this with confidence, but as you said, his titles are really good.
The great titles. I'll absolutely give him that.
It's almost like, in true, somewhat autistic, online bound, very online before it was a thing, fashion, that he was a very, very cerebral person. Walked in, quite smart, I'm sure. Not always the best writer, but very, very engaged with very real and interesting ideas. Who really, and very spiritual, of course, too. And it seems like he really wanted. He had like almost a fetish, maybe. That's an unfair way of putting it, but he very much wanted maybe to be part of this world of becoming, which is why you have the associations of him with like literal right-wing terrorists in Italy. I think that appealed to him.
Yeah.
But
he
the relation between that and the
violence.
heady ideas is nebulous. And that, of course, brings it, to my books. Dragon Days has flavors of that too. Where I mean, the professor character is not exactly a hero, right? Like I do think there's some interesting ideas sort of in the mouth of the Professor Wallingford character, but overall, maybe some of his shortcomings or dangerous aspects are similar to how Evola was, where it's like, yes, these are interesting ideas about the problems of modernity, but do you really, give the blessing to the, radical student with a bomb in their backpack, which hopefully I'm not slandering, but I do think Evola was like, he was associated with right-wing youth who would do such things. So, yeah.
It's associated with, and then when you read him though, he'll be like, look, the way to connect to the world of being is through. So he had a very mechanistic view of ritual in that. So the Romans performing some sacred game or something had a direct mechanistic correspondence to the world of becoming, and you were impressing your triumphal seal upon some aspect of it, which would have concrete effects in the world of becoming. It was. I didn't actually know what he said about terrorism. When it comes to him talking about action that interacts with the world of being, like it's so much more woo-woo and supernatural than I think many people realize.
Yeah, and maybe it must be. This world of being is rather nebulous, but like I do believe in it. Is what I would say. And it again, the problem animating my own work and the Black Album and stuff like is this issue of like how do we properly interact with this world of being? Well, in the modern world, you have options. You can do it through organized religion. You can do it through yoga, and a lot of you can do it through esotericism. And a lot of these things are somehow, to varying degrees, flawed, I believe. But these options are still available, and just a question of how you do it. And it's easy to get very burned out and cynical about them all, and then just feed back into the fundamental nihilistic problem of modernity. But just as an inherently, I don't know, optimistic or hopeful person, I like to think like that there is some ultimate reality and some ultimate source that we will and can go back to. I'm not personally convinced it's like the modern Catholic Church or some offshoot of it. But maybe it is, you know. I don't know. But I'm interested in whatever that is, and I appreciate people like Junger, who, similar to me, I guess, or to what I must do given my own modern situation, like, who are willing to experiment, you know, whether it's with psychedelics or just, you know, different modes of thought. There is something to those limit experiences, I think, that he talks about, whether it's war or even with drugs or whatever, that bring you there. But then it's a question of like, is the war, like, this is somewhat of a side topic, but like, you know, if you're in a just war, you know, and certainly Junger, when he was young and fighting, I'm sure believed very much in the German cause, right? It's like you have that limit experience, but it's also for this, you had this limit experience that brings you in touch with the world of being, right? But you're also performing something in the world of becoming that you also believe is good.
Mm.
And I feel like maybe what we're missing now is any kind of confidence that there's anything in the world of becoming that is actually worthwhile and good. It's not just neutral, banal day-to-day stuff.
It is an interesting aspect of modernity. That in so I won't drink the description of post-modernity Kool-Aid of saying, you know, well, it's the rejection of any sort of large or overarching narratives, because I think that description of post-modernity itself is an overarching narrative.
Oh, for sure.
But
yeah,
I do think that intense, reflexive skepticism of anything that's not a very, very materialistic utilitarianism, which I think is, in many ways, actually what a lot of post-modernity washes out to when you really push it.
Yeah.
This is a very skeptical, materialistic utilitarianism, or just a default utilitarianism. The thing with that, and with that, not even skepticism, but hostility towards any sort of narrative that would say, in your example, make a war feel just, or make a ritualistic organization like a church or a religious organization, and, you know, animate that. It feels sort of self-defeating, because over time it feels like that's the sort of thing that just decays any sort of social cooperation or any sort of coordination of a large number of people. It's the sort of thing that I'd expect in almost a Darwinian sense of ideas, or a Darwinian sense of societies, in there, how these ideas make people behave individually and with respect to one another. It just dies out compared to something that can make people coordinate and make them willing to make sacrifices for some sort of larger narrative. Now, I don't think that necessarily makes something true or not, if it makes people cooperate in that way or coordinate.
Yeah.
But I do think, in a sort of a basely Darwinistic sense, it makes it outcompete post-modernity.
Yeah. No, I think so. I think that kind of brings us back to that interesting Dugin pivot you brought up earlier, and that I think has kept coming up in our conversation about how it's like his ideas are interesting, but then it's like it somehow has to be grafted onto Russian imperialism. Well, why? It's not that the ideas inherently are Russian imperialistic, but it's that you need to connect your ideas to something in the world of becoming, in his case, Russian imperialism, geopolitics, that actually gives it steam. The predicament in America and in the West is that it's really very hard, unless you kind of throw your lot in with, I mean, you have a few options if you're kind of like on the right wing side of things. You know, you could become frankly traitorous, and I mean, I don't know. I guess you can support Russia without hating the United States, whatever. But like, you could just basically become a Duginist, or, you know, obviously there's kind of like more paleocon sort of types, or like, you know, the West is worth fighting for, but it needs to be totally, you know, returned to an earlier state. Obviously, there's something there to be fought for, but it's very, very unpopular offline.
Yeah.
So there's a few options. Where else was I getting at here? Sorry. You need to, yeah, basically you need to graft these more spiritually fulfilling ideas about humanity and what makes, what makes, what brings out the best in us, which most of us agree is struggle in some capacity. Most of us agree, like, I mean, most of us on the right anyway, agree that war and struggle sort of bring these characteristics out. So just throwing out options, like there's people who kind of take the more paleocon, like return to an earlier state. Maybe that involves some militarism or takeover, overthrow of the government, whatever. There, you could also throw in your lot with other parts of the world, whether it's Duginism, another very controversial name that gets dropped in the book, just kind of in the Black Album, just for food for thought. It references this British terrorist group, the Order of Nine Angles. By no coincidence, the founder of that group was a radical Islamist for many years.
Yeah.
There's people who do that, so like that's an option. The other option is actually being a neocon, basically. Like I think part of my reading on Leo Strauss, and maybe this comes out in the book, is that like some of those, not necessarily like Bush administration pro-war people, I don't want to give them too much intellectual credit, but like a lot of the original neocons were aware of this issue. They read their Carl Schmitt and their Spengler, certainly, and they knew kind of there was this issue of, the West is facing this crisis of nihilism. We need it needs to fight for itself, basically. And neoconservatism in a lot of ways, or Straussianism, I'm doing a little bit too brief of a gloss on it here, but in a lot of ways, I think it comes out of that awareness of the issue of nihilism and of kind of trying to give America and the United States and Westernism, some kind of grounding to fight for itself, out of this same, I believe, awareness of what you mentioned as, the Darwinistically, evolutionarily necessary thing of, and this is a central preoccupation of Dragon Day, as well as the Black Album, of finding this overarching narrative thrust to glom society together and give people a reason worth living and fighting and breeding for. I feel, maybe I'm a little in the clouds here, but
go off.
Yeah, no, I think that this is a real issue, and that again, I guess just very cursorily listed, reactionary Westernism, anti-Westernism, or neoconservatism are kind of like the three big like paths out, and I do find them all fairly dissatisfying, and personally relate more to people like Junger, who were just kind of radically experimental. And in terms of the Nietzsche Heidegger thing I mentioned earlier, I guess part of the hope in the Junger type figure is like, well, we don't exactly know what this new overarching narrative will be, but if there's people who are bold enough to experiment within this postmodern paradigm of reality, then eventually maybe a path will start to present itself.
Junger was fascinating because his way of doing it. So I mean, as just to respond to what you said, predictions are easy to make, and I don't put too much store by mine. But I suspect that one, we'll find paths out of nihilism. I don't think the human race is going to commit suicide.
Yeah.
And I suspect the paths lie in the future, because we face a new set of circumstances, and I really think from those circumstances is going to arise some sort of path from nihilism. Now, I don't pretend to know what it'll look like. In the case of Junger, it's really interesting that I guess this is because he's just very right-wing fundamentally. His path out of nihilism, so through the forest, is highly individualistic, and he described it as aristocratic. So you demonstrate your belonging to this aristocracy of the spirit, or whatever you want to call it, by basically directly experiencing this world of being. Like that's how you do it, and no one can do it for you. And I just, in part, it's the novelty of a sort of very, very right-wing woo-woo of him saying, no, it's, you've got an aristocracy, it's based on this you could call it a spiritual connection, you could call it an experiential connection, erotic connection, whatever you want to call it, to this atemporal underlying reality. Some people can leave behind symbols that might point the direction, but ultimately only you can do it, and no one else is going to do it for you, which is fascinating and also doesn't scale.
It doesn't scale.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's what I was. I'm not giving myself credit. Whatever. Without reading that book, I think that's kind of what I was getting at with the Black Album too.
This is why. So I messaged you on, like, sent you a DM on Twitter about the Forest Passage when I was reading the Black Album, because I just kind of assumed that you'd read it because of the similarities between the two.
Yeah, well, it sounds like I need to read it, and I will be critical of my own book and maybe Junger as well. As you said, it doesn't scale, and like there's got to be more to it than that. But within the kind of postmodern position, like it is hard to point to anything but the most cursory, symbolic, as you said, direction to find in that. Certainly there's not a lot of sort of institutions that I particularly trust to take me there. And again, right-wing inegalitarianism, I am, not that I'm saying I'm one necessarily, but this general, glossed in Nietzsche as well, this notion of aristocratic radicalism, or that there's like a certain number of people who are maybe more naturally called to this. Yeah, I would say that I do adhere to that somewhat. I think that the sort of natural founders of new tradition, as I put it in my book, and as Bap sort of talks about as well, who's obviously in this school of thought, will sort of naturally arise. And as you said, I do think some of the way they arise may be due to circumstances that we can't even predict currently, because one thing is, as static and sometimes drained of life as modernity may feel, we can certainly be sure that it will continue to change and that more things will arise. Now, personally, a lot of the shit that's happened over the past 5 to 10 years has been pretty stupid, whether it's the pandemic or what. And I don't know if it's been the most fertile ground for this kind of new tradition to emerge, but I believe it's out there. And this also kind of relates to the tradition versus order thing. I guess for a while, and maybe this is a young man's game a little bit, and maybe it's akin to Junger, in the trenches, and really believing in that particular kind of experience where it's very sort of the competing wills, right? I think when I was a little younger, I really thought, like, you have to kind of figure it out, like you have to understand like what you want from the world and then go and try and create that. And I'm a little more mystical now myself, in that it's more like, the order that will arise will be spontaneous and will be much bigger than the vision or even understanding of any one person, is more what I lean toward now. Deep water stuff, but yeah.
My position's much more of hope, in that I really don't know if there's something firm that we ultimately latch onto. I don't know if there's some sort of higher meaning or anything like that. It's ultimately a desire for that to be the case. I'm probably even more nebulous than you are on this.
But I think the nebulousness is almost necessary. Well, not necessary. I don't know. There's people who really have a view of the way things should be, and they often create a great deal of change in the world of becoming, and maybe the world wouldn't be so good or effective if everyone was as woo-woo as I am. So maybe there's a give and take here. But
I think it's also the acknowledgement that you don't know where the next good idea is going to come from, because if you knew, you would already have the next good idea. Like it wouldn't exist in the future anymore. So I think also an openness to new things. So even a few years ago, I would have just completely dismissed out of hand anything that I considered even remotely supernatural. That's not to say I believe in the supernatural anymore. It's more, I think, our idea of what is natural and what isn't natural is ultimately a human construct. It's a construction of logos. It's a cartographic exercise. It's not direct experience. It's trying to map a territory and every map
Yeah.
is ultimately going to be wrong. Some maps are quite
Right.
useful.
No.
So it's more an acknowledgement of my own limitedness, I
Yeah.
suppose. My willingness to entertain these sort of ideas. I don't want to be so arrogant as to think that I perfectly know the contours of
Yeah.
reality.
Yeah. I guess that's kind of what I meant by like we must be a little bit nebulous, is because I really do think whatever the ultimate reality is, it is vastly bigger than any human understanding. And that's not to say that the maps we make are not useful, because they are. But it's all too easy to kind of forget how small our understanding of things is.
How small it is and how remarkable it is, in the sense that we're made of the same stuff as asteroids
Yeah.
or stars, as as dumb rocks or really big nuclear fusion reactions, but we're also aware of the fact that we're made of the same stuff.
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah. It's
the
profound.
the self-ordering nature of the universe and whatever underlying, say, structure there is, or whatever base material there is I suppose that's probably the main thing that gives me some sort of hope that there is some larger, I wouldn't say it's some sort of human consciousness, but there's something very spooky going on in that in our
Sure.
universe, it has this latent creative potential where if you just heat up hydrogen for a few billion years, there's suddenly some tiny pocket of the universe just becomes aware of itself. It turns into
Yeah.
life.
It's spooky.
And
Spooky is a good word. Yeah.
that spookiness, that self-assembling complexity is something I actually just don't know what to make of, but it feels pregnant enough with meaning, or a potential meaning, that's what at the moment I'm focusing on.
Yeah. No, similar here. And the idea, it's related to the chaos order thing. I'm probably reiterating something I already said, but the idea, the idea of a primordial chaos and an order that comes out of that. And there is this emphasis on the extent to which we create order, but a lot of the order is spontaneous, and that's where it gets really spooky and really beautiful, is kind of where that comes from. So that's
I'd say
interesting.
almost all of the order seems to be spontaneous, because even human wills are ultimately, like, they're made of the
Right.
same
Oh yeah, like what's the
background.
difference?
Like, that's the remarkable thing. It's this bizarre, unimaginably enormous self-assembling clockwork that I
Absolutely, yeah.
truly don't know what to make of.
Yeah, yeah. But standing back and being in awe of it certainly is good.
I
We're
think the
definitely
awe is
we're
important.
getting into the deeper water, but like this is, the basic sort of, I don't know if you call it religious or spiritual, but sort of impulse that I try to keep a hand on. And in the Black Album, the whole idea of creating your own rituals is to like somehow be reminded of that, as much as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, to remind people to pay attention, that something very, not only is something very unusual happening, but we are fundamentally of that very, very strange thing that's currently happening.
Yeah. And I guess in the world of becoming, in the world of politics, it's a little bit of a question of like, the super reactionary trad thing is like, we're so out of touch with that like the world as it is needs to be like destroyed or something. And I lean a little more nuanced. Like,
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know, like even in, funny sort of literary reference, but I'm not like a neo-sincere guy very much, but certainly David Foster Wallace was another influence on both Dragon Day and the Black Album. And he sort of had his interesting take on, nihilism within modernity, but trying to find meaning within that. And it's really corny to be a David Foster Wallace bro, but I don't know. But there's another, one of many writers who is trying to think through some of these issues that has been influential on me. I feel like a lot of my writing is, a lot of my creative contributions are bringing unexpected people or writers or thinkers together, and I think what I'll keep working on will sort of continue in that vein in many ways.
Yeah. I feel like I'm one of the, I don't know how many people there are at the moment who are willing to say unambiguously they really like David Foster Wallace's writing, but yeah, I loved Infinite Jest. I thought it was
definitely. Yeah.
Obnoxious, but wonderful.
For sure. Yeah.
So is there any projects of yours that you want to bring up again that you want listeners to be aware of when they come away from this podcast? Of course, I think listeners, basically anyone who's slightly interested, should read Dragon Day. If they really like that and want more, read the Black Album. Probably don't recommend, actually, someone just jumping into the Black Album without more context, because I think you'll just get way less out of it.
I would agree with that. Yeah. Listen to more podcasts or read Dragon Day first. But yeah, no, Dragon Day is, I'm very proud of it. It is currently on Terror House Press. And will continue to be. I am going to reissue it with a new cover, I think, at least, when the legality of that gets sorted out on New Ritual Press. Yeah, the main thing I'd want to pitch would be New Ritual Press, which should be, I don't want to give a date, but should be going live hopefully before the new year, when we have a logo, we're going to have a website.
Oh, damn, that soon.
Yeah, it's going to be
nice.
This is our project 2025, right? I have a friend named Omar King here in Los Angeles who's he's written a short story collection that's probably going to be our first published work. I think it's really good. That's completely separate territory entirely from anything I've ever written. It's more I don't even know how to pitch it. Omar's a very singular visionary guy and is an artist as well as a short story writer. And they're basically surreal, sort of John Kennedy Toole meets Dennis Cooper meets William S. Burroughs short vignettes with accompanying art.
Nice.
Between that and the other things we're going to be reissuing and publishing with New Ritual, I would say that is the main. Going into 2025, I will continue to write and will continue to be a writer and a podcaster, but I will also be very much wearing the publisher hat, I think, for the foreseeable future. Within that, I am at, if you look up Matt P969 on Twitter, on X, you will find me. I'm open to, reading people's stuff. I'm looking, we're looking for, new voices, as it were. So I would love to collaborate if you're interested in publishing with me and my associates. Long story short, to answer your question, New Ritual Press is going to be the big thing going forward. I've pitched this elsewhere. I'm starting to outline another novel that will eventually come to light. But as anyone who's written novels knows, timeline, not so sure, it would take a while. I'm working on a collection of essays that is mostly about music. Not necessarily in a Nietzsche birth of tragedy way, it's not about classical music, fortunately or unfortunately. It's about like popular music. It's Chuck Klosterman-esque. And I've already published some of these on my Substack, Strange Flows. Chuck Klosterman-esque, very autobiographical, sort of gonzo music journalism about the influence of different music on my life, I guess, or memories associated with music and things of this nature, combined with, I guess, cultural criticism, similar to what you get a little bit of in the Black Album. That will probably be my next book. Everyone who's read the Black Album is like, this is good, but like, write more fiction. And so maybe I'm not delivering on that, but at some point there will be more fiction, probably more short stories before anything long will come out, but that'll be there too. Next book will probably be the music book, and main project would be New Ritual Press.
Nice. I'll link to as many of these things as I can in the show notes.
Yeah, I'll send you.
If there's a website or something for New Ritual that you want me to put in there too, just send it over.
It's forthcoming. I'll maybe when it's out we can retroactively add it, or
I'll just add it in.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you. This was fantastic. Yeah.
To what you write next. Looking forward to seeing what New Ritual puts out.
For sure. Yeah, thanks so much. I'm looking forward to, I kind of told you offline, I haven't heard a lot of your previous episodes. I will certainly be seeking those out now, and I feel this is the beginning of a longer discourse between us, so I'm
when you publish something new, if you want to come on here to promote it, feel free. Just let me know.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that.
All right, see you. And
all right,
listeners,
take care.
See you next time.
Have a good day.